John's teenage years were punctuated by tragic losses. The first was his beloved Uncle George, Mimi's husband. He collapsed at home one Sunday afternoon and died instantly from a massive liver hemorrhage. His death came without any warning, and to John, who was 14 and had looked on George as a father, it was a terrible shock. His mother's death 3 years later also came out of the blue. One July evening she had been round to Mimi's for a cup of tea and a chat. Despite their past disagreements, the two still got on well, and like the other Stanley sisters, loved gossiping over a pot of tea. John wasn't there. Julia had left him at her own house with Bobby and the girls. When Julia left to catch her bus home, Mimi waved her off. Sometimes she walked with her to the bus stop, but that night she didn't. Seconds later, Julia was hit by a car as she crossed the road outside Mimi's house. She died instantly. That night, a policeman broke the news to John and Bobby. John's little sisters were in bed, and as Bobby's mother was there, John and Bobby went to Sefton General Hospital, where Julia had been taken. John couldn't bear to see her, but Bobby went in to say goodbye. When he came out, he collapsed in tears in John's arms. John went to her funeral in a daze, unable to believe that his vibrant, laughing mother was inside the wooden coffin everyone was filing past. Her death was made worse for everyone by the fact that the man who killed her was a drunk off-duty policeman and a learner driver who had apparently hit the accelerator instead of the brake when he saw Julia crossing. When he went to court, he was acquitted of the charges, and the only punishment he received was a reprimand and a period of suspension from duty. Early in 1960, John moved in with Stuart Sutcliffe. A second mattress was laid on the floor. There was plenty of space because the room was enormous, and his chaos combined with Stuart's created a pad that was at best unusual and at worst a shambles. He and Stuart loved living together, and when Stuart won £60 in a prestigious art competition, John persuaded him to spend the lot on a bass guitar and join the Quarrymen. Stuart wasn't a natural musician and struggled to master the guitar, his fingers calloused and bleeding as he practiced for hour after hour. When the boys did a gig, he often turned away from the audience so that they couldn't see how little he was playing. John knew Stuart was the group's weak link, but he didn't care. He wanted him along. It was the perfectionist Paul who found such an inexperienced guitarist hard to accept, and this led to rows and even fights between him and Stuart. I think Paul was also a bit jealous of Stu. Until then, he had had most of John's attention. The boys had started playing at a club called the Jacaranda on Slater Street, not far from college. The Jack, as we called it, was in a cellar, like the Casbah. Condensation dripped off the walls, and it was so dark inside that we could hardly see each other, but this added to the slightly dangerous, exciting atmosphere. The Quarrymen got their first gig there after John begged the owner, a bluff Welshman called Alan Williams, to give them a chance. Some of Liverpool's biggest groups played at the Jack, including Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, whose drummer was a lad called Ringo Starr. By now the boys had smartened themselves up a bit. They all wore black jeans and polo necks, which gave them an edge over some of the other fledgling beat groups, then doing the rounds in Liverpool. They'd also dropped the old skiffle sound and the ballads by Cliff Richard and the Everly Brothers in favour of the far more exciting rock and roll numbers that were racing up the charts. To fit with their changing image, the boys decided it was time for a new name. We had a hilarious brainstorming session over a beer-soaked table in the Renshaw Hall bar, where we often drank. John loved Buddy Holly and the Crickets, so they toyed with insect names. It was John who came up with Beatles, B-E-E-T-L-E-S. He changed it to Beatles with an A, because he said if you turned it round, it was Les Beat, which sounded French and cool. Soon afterward, Alan Williams got the boys an audition with a man called Larry Parnes, who had a reputation for creating stars. He had discovered Tommy Steele, who was a huge name then, Marty Wilde, and Billy Fury, among others. He was in Liverpool looking for a backing group to go on tour with Billy Fury, and John and Paul were wild with excitement, as they still didn't have a drummer, A guy from one of the other bands stood in at the audition to help them out. The boys failed the audition and Paul blamed Stuart's poor playing, but Parnes offered them an alternative, backing one of his lesser-known singers, Johnny Gentle, on a tour of northern Scotland for 2 weeks, for a fee of £18 each. This was their biggest break by far, and they were delighted. When the boys got back from the tour, they were exhausted, filthy, sick of the sight of the van, and high on their success. They'd played ballrooms and night spots in out-of-the-way places and had received an enthusiastic welcome. It was the first time any of them had been asked for their autograph, which had made them feel like stars, and they loved it. John and I couldn't wait to be alone together, so Stuart went out for a few hours. We began to make love until a sharp abdominal pain made me cry out and brought things to an abrupt halt. John became more and more concerned as I writhed in agony and begged him to get me home. We got dressed and he took me to the station, where I crawled onto the train. As soon as I walked through the door, my mother took one look at my white, drawn face and called an ambulance. It was appendicitis, and I was stuck in hospital for 2 weeks. I recovered in time to sit my exams and was delighted when I passed, but John, despite my best efforts to help him at the last minute, failed dismally. I had sat over his lettering for hours while he and Stuart cracked jokes and peered over my shoulder, but it wasn't enough to save him. He had done virtually no work that year and was thrown out of the college before his final year. In August 1960, Alan Williams offered them a 6-week stint playing in a nightclub in Hamburg, Germany. He had been exporting groups over there since a German seaman had heard a steel band playing in the Jacaranda and told people back home how good they were. A Hamburg nightclub had engaged them, and Alan had followed them there and got to know a man called Bruno Koschmider, owner of the Kaiserkeller nightclub. Bruno agreed to try out a Liverpool beat group called Derry and the Seniors. When they proved a success, he asked Alan for another group. He suggested the Beatles. The boys were due to leave for Hamburg in 2 weeks' time, on August the 16th. There was just one problem: they still didn't have a drummer. They racked their brains until someone mentioned Pete Best. The Blackjacks had fallen apart when a couple of the members decided to move on, so Pete had a great set of drums and no group. Like Paul, he had left school that summer with good enough qualifications to get into college, but by this time he had a taste for the entertainment business. Paul gave him a ring and invited him to join the Beatles for the Hamburg trip. He leapt at the chance, and he, Stu, John, Paul and George were on their way. Pete was good-natured but very quiet, with the kind of sultry, moody looks that had girls flocking round him, while the other boys mucked around, teased each other mercilessly and wisecracked their way through rehearsals. Pete said little, and often seemed to be in his own little world. He seldom showed any emotion. He was as happy as the others to be going to Hamburg, but while they leapt around shouting, "Look out, you Krauts, here we come," Pete shrugged, smiled, and got on with setting up his drums. The story of the boys' first trip to Hamburg has now passed into legend, but I had my own unique perspective on it through John's many long, detailed letters. He was graphic about their living conditions. They had expected to play in the Kaiserkeller, but when they arrived they were told they'd be playing in another of Bruno Koschmider's clubs, the much smaller Indra. The previous act had been a risque girly show. Most of the punters made it clear that they didn't think much of the Beatles and wanted the girls back. The boys had to work hard to win them over. The audience expected a real show, and the boys weren't about to let them down.